All right, we're starting off now with some exclusive news from I-24. According to two official sources from the Gulf, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE are in the midst of negotiations to create a defense security alliance. Well, joining us with the latest on this is our defense correspondent, Daniel Tzemach. So, Daniel, first of all, break down what this means and what we know so far.
Right, Natasha. So these are really initial sort of reports coming from two official sources who spoke to I-24 News directly, indicating that Israel is in the midst of some sort of operation or movement and negotiation towards reaching an alliance with Gulf states like Bahrain, like the United Arab Emirates, and like Saudi Arabia. Now, this would likely resemble what we see in NATO, which is, of course, composed of several different countries, most of those countries, of course, being European countries, but also the United States. And in this case, we're talking about a regional alliance, one that would make ultimately a whole lot of sense for Israel, especially when it comes to the mutual concern between the different states I mentioned, which is, of course, Iran, and more specifically, Iran's nuclear program. And when we look at the context right now, we can understand that they would have all of these different parties an interest in reaching some sort of agreement and establishing some sort of alliance to protect their interests.
Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise. You know, what is the context that's supporting this development?
Right, so we can look at different things that have happened in the past few months, not least of which, of course, is the change of power in the United States. We saw Donald Trump leaving the White House. We've seen Joe Biden entering the White House. And for countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia, they may be more affected by that change in power than most others, certainly any other Middle Eastern state. You could argue Egypt maybe also has concerns in mind. But ultimately, when it comes to how close Israel and its Prime Minister Netanyahu and Donald Trump were, as well as the leaders of Saudi Arabia, there's no question that Biden represents a different sort of leader in the White House, who's made his chief interest and chief goal to be re-engaging with Iran, to re-agree upon a previously agreed agreement, which is, of course, the 2015 JCPOA. Israel and Saudi Arabia, two of the countries that would certainly be concerned about that. The other countries that would also be concerned would be countries like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, who, of course, also see Iran's movements, especially in the military sphere, as potential threats. So that does provide a very logical sort of sequence of events and a pattern that would allow this sort of alliance to really fall into place for all parties. It seems like a win-win.
Well, how could this alliance work against Israel's interests?
Right. So ultimately, there are issues here. This could ruffle feathers with countries, not least of which are the United States. Israel and Saudi Arabia going forward on something presumably unilaterally without coordination with America could definitely create some sort of friction, if you will, between the Western powers and really in regards to America's interest in engaging with Iran through diplomacy. This sort of maneuvering could complicate that process significantly, especially when Iran sees, if it were to come to fruition, Israel getting closer to some of its own neighboring states. That gives Israel a military advantage, so to speak, on having access to certain borders, certain airspaces. And in that sense, this could definitely complicate any effort being made by Iran or the United States, for that matter, to get closer to reaching an understanding or even approaching the negotiating table. This sort of development could definitely disrupt that in some way.
Now, Israel's known to not enter defense treaties, even with its closest allies like the U.S. and NATO. Why is that the case?
Right, so if you were to ask military experts, they would say that Israel has an interest in having freedom of movement, that any agreement in some way is, of course, in and of itself binding. It's committal. That's why they would have an agreement. But in other senses, it also commits them to certain issues that they might not want to be a party to. Israel could enjoy certain freedoms by not having military partnerships, so things aren't in the open, which means that they could have more freedom of maneuvering and mobility under the surface, and that's something that Israel has certainly made it an interest and a top priority issue to be able to maneuver discreetly, whether it be stealth aircrafts like the F-35, one that allows Israel a very wide range of capabilities, and ultimately this could limit Israel's ability to do things like that.